Capitalism is often considered an essential characteristic of U.S. democracy. The fiscal principles which guide American economics are hugely defining of the nation and can be traced back to the theories of a single Scottish man named Adam Smith and his incredibly influential text, The Wealth of Nations. Adam Smith was a moral philosopher and prominent figure during the Scottish Enlightenment. At 14, he began studying social philosophy at the University of Glasgow, where he developed a passion for liberty, reason, and free speech, before going on to continue his education at the University of Oxford. Smith's first body of work, The Theory of Moral Sentiment, focused primarily on the depths of charity and virtue, laying an ethical foundation for the economic ideas on which he would later reflect. Smith began writing The Wealth of Nations during a time of distinct social and political unrest. Most European common land had been seized by the gentry, and thousands of dislocated farmers roamed the countryside as paupers. The advent of 19th century industrialization was near, and the indications of this were present across the nation. Young children and pregnant women worked 12-hour days in both mining and manufacturing industries, while the government, which was dictated entirely by the landed and merchant classes, made no attempt to address the economic tension. Instead, the state was often used as a mechanism for the ruling classes to enact short-sighted policies to further the narrow fiscal interests of those in power. In writing The Wealth of Nations, Smith aimed to challenge the absolute economic control of the ruling classes. He argued against government interference, hoping to deter the use of regulation and limiting the mobility of his nation's citizens. His work was hugely influential and is regarded by many historians as equally important as the Declaration of Independence in guiding the course of the United States history. Smith's work is considered a capitalist Bible and has had huge impact on United States economic structure. The Wealth of Nations focused primarily on the idea of a free market. Smith believed that trade should be open and fluid, unrestricted by the tyranny of intrusive government regulation. He argued that foreign trade could be mutually beneficial and that it was not something to be feared. He also believed that the advancements of one country did not need to come at the expense of another, and that a nation would be more successful if its trading partners were prosperous. Adam Smith also championed the idea of the invisible hand. This was a metaphor he constructed for what he perceived to be the self-regulating nature of the marketplace. Individuals, he claimed, were capable of maximizing and sustaining profit without the use of government intervention. He believed that trade should not be restricted nationally and that it was not the state's place to control the market or economy. He trusted individuals in maintaining economic peace, while he believed that it was possible for an economy to succeed even if the ambitious did not have benevolent intentions, he also believed in the virtue of altruism and the impulse men had to help one another. In his seminal work, he wrote, "How selfish soever man may be supposed, there are evidently some principles in his nature which interest him in the fortune of others, and render their happiness necessary to him, though he derives nothing from it except the pleasure of seeing it." Since the 18th century, Smith's idea of capitalism has been adapted and reinterpreted by countless scholars and economists. Ayn Rand, an American novelist and philosopher who wrote during the 20th century, is one of the most prominent figures to reflect on capitalism, focusing primarily on the idea of self-interest. While Smith considered selfishness an inevitable human trait, Rand deemed it a virtue. Diverging from the Wealth of Nations' emphasis on the importance of charity and ethics, she declared rational self-interest and self-fulfilling individualism to be mankind's most important goals. She believed that government restrictions were more dangerous in limiting the potential of great men than in furthering the oppression of the poor. Rand voiced opposition to all forms of welfare, unemployment insurance, and support for low-income and middle class, regulation of the industry, and government provision for roads or other infrastructure. America's economic principles were subject to further change with the election of Ronald Reagan. In his 1980 election campaigns, Reagan presented supply-side economics, which reduced government regulation in order to promote corporate growth as a return to free market capitalism. Reaganomics, as the late president's policies would come to be called, promoted lowering income tax and capital tax gain rates. Reagan lowered the oil windfall profit tax in 1981, which would later end completely. He later authorized the Tax Reform Act of 1986, which sought to eliminate deductions, lower marginal tax rates for the wealthy, and significantly raise taxes on those earning less than $50,000 a year. In 1982, Reagan agreed to a rollback of corporate tax cuts and a smaller rollback of individual income tax cuts. The 1982 tax increase ended a third of the initial tax cut. In 1983, Reagan instituted a payroll tax on Social Security and Medicare hospital insurance. Reagan's policies have been criticized for worsening class divisions, with the Center for Labor Market Studies at Northwestern University determining 37% of young families with children stuck in a life of poverty at the end of Reagan's first term. Guided by the free market ideas initially proposed in the Wealth of Nations, the United States enacted NAFTA, a trilateral free trade agreement, in 1994. The primary purpose of NAFTA was to eliminate tariffs on goods traded among the US, Mexico, and Canada, with the bill fully being implemented by 2008. The agreement, which was signed by President Bill Clinton, yielded unfortunate consequences, resulting in $181 billion U.S. trade deficit with NAFTA partners Mexico and Canada, and the related loss of 1 million net U.S. jobs, growing income inequality, displacement of more than 1 million Mexican campesino workers, and a doubling of desperate migration from Mexico, and more than $360 million paid to corporations after investor state tribunal tax on and rollbacks of domestic public interest policies. U.S. trade deficit growth with Mexico and Canada has been 45% higher than with countries not party to a U.S. free trade agreement, and a 2012 Angus Reid public opinion poll found that 53% of Americans believe the U.S. should do whatever is necessary to renegotiate or leave NAFTA, while only 15% believe that the U.S. should continue to be a member of NAFTA. In spite of this, President Obama has joined the same corporate leaders of NAFTA in trying to promote the Trans-Pacific Partnership, dubbed by many critics as NAFTA on steroids, which would roll back Wall Street reforms and offshore millions of American jobs. Reaganomics and supply-side economics are still widely practiced and referred to in modern American capitalism. Many politicians refer to these free market theories in discussing potential policy. Eric Cantor, a U.S. representative for the state of Virginia, said in a campaign speech, "I am not for raising taxes in a recession, especially when it comes to job creators, that we need so desperately to start creating jobs again." Rand Paul has echoed such sentiment, declaring, "In a perfect world, we would bring corporate tax rates down to 25% or less so we can get competitive in the world economy. Ultimately, I would love to see a flat tax." In November of 2013, $5 billion worth of cuts were made to the food stamp program, and the Senate is currently discussing an additional $8 billion worth of reductions. A report by Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist David K. Johnson, conducted for the Tax Analysis, found incomes of the bottom 90% of Americans grew $59 between 1966 and 2011, while incomes for the top 10% rose by $116,071. In the United States, rational self-interest is often justified as the ultimate channel to freedom. Economic deregulation is used more frequently in unrestricting corporations or job creators than it is in protecting low-income people from exploitation. In writing The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith strove to branch moral philosophy and economic principle. He hoped to justify self-interest as inevitable, claiming that it should not give the government more reason to restrict the potential of the era's working class. However, in modern day, capitalism and the idea of a free market are used to enable large corporations and limit the mobility of people who are the least free. Our economy has regressed through free trade policies and corporate tax cuts to the initial state of inequity which Smith strove so hard initially to defeat.